This week, as the White House carousel spins ever faster and the media gets more and more dizzy, the dreamers watch from the sidelines as their dreams spin into the politics of 2018.
I was flown up to Washington, D.C. to speak at the National Press Club, and I told my story in front of like 40 reporters. And they were all in awe because I was willing to give my name, have my picture taken, and they were just like, do you know the trouble you're putting yourself in?
On Capitol Hill, the blame game gets even more intense.
President Trump has rejected 6 different bipartisan proposals to pass a law and solve the problem he created. He is the key to solving the DACA problem.
And from the front lines of litigation, one of the country's top immigration lawyers talks to me about her battles against the Muslim ban, attacks on safe cities, and DACA.
This is an administration that has tried to have it both ways, talking about love in their heart for DACA recipients, yet shutting down the program and not negotiating in good faith with Congress. So I think that it really calls the question of President Trump, are you really going to be the person who shuts down a program that has done so much good for this country and that 86% of Americans support?
And as baseball emerges from hibernation, did you know we are less than 2 weeks from opening day? Saturday Night Live hits a home run. From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani with Only in America. Karen Tumlin, based in Los Angeles, is the legal director of the National Immigration Law Center, which defends and advances the rights of low-income immigrants. The daughter of an immigrant parent herself, Karen says she's privileged to be in the heat of the immigration battle. Karen walked me through the major court cases impacting the immigrant community. We started with President Trump's efforts to ban entry to immigrants from selected Middle Eastern countries, or as it's come to be known, the Muslim ban.
It was on the campaign trail, right? Trump made it very clear he wanted to enact a Muslim ban. And look, he didn't stop saying that. He didn't stop saying it when he took the oath of office. He didn't stop saying it when the first Muslim ban was struck down or the second. Instead, he's continued to say, oh, he's going to go back to the drawing board and get it right this time and really enact a ban. And you know what that means. The implication, the courts have said, is that means to ban Muslims. And he's continued to engage in Islamophobic, rhetoric out of the Oval Office. So that, it isn't terminology, and it's certainly not terminology to the families impacted. And that's, I think it's always an important point to highlight. But here's where the case is now. April 25th. That is the date that the Supreme Court is going to hear one of the challenges to the latest incarnation of the Muslim ban. That is the case brought by the state of Hawaii. It will be argued by Neil Katyal, who is a very distinguished Supreme Court practitioner. And it's really an important day, right? Right now, we have a state of play where when the Supreme Court decided to hear the case, they allowed the Muslim ban to go into effect. And we know that family members and others are being separated from their families as a result of this ban. And so on April 25th, the High Court is going to consider for the first time whether or not it is allowable under federal statutory law or the Constitution to keep this Muslim ban in place.
So at the end of the day, this is a ban on Muslims from specific countries that has very little, if anything, to do with national security concerns. And that is part of the conflict that has been surfaced over the last year.
Absolutely. That is part of the conflict. And it's, and I also think if you zoom out, this is really a case that presents questions about belonging and whether or not we would allow actions against certain nations without evidence to show that they are actually a national security risk, but instead making assumptions based on majority of religious preference.
Another case that has surfaced recently is around the question of indefinite detention. I think that much of the American public doesn't realize that there were limits on, how long an immigrant could be detained given or whether or not their home country would allow their return. And it's a very complicated issue. It's a big question that I think has repercussions, I'm not sure people entirely understand the repercussions. So I was wondering if you could break down that question of indefinite detention and where those cases are, and what your take is on the long-term repercussions.
The most recent decision, of course, out of the Supreme Court is the Rodriguez decision. This is a case litigated by the ACLU of Southern California by Ahilan Arulanantham. And I say that really also to point folks to the tremendous resources that the ACLU of Southern California has put out since this ruling. But biggest picture, this ruling was a real blow to the immigrants' rights community, and most importantly, to immigrant families who have a loved one in detention. The ruling was based on a 1996 law that allowed for mandatory detention of certain immigrants. But what federal courts had found, and in fact, 2 federal circuit courts had found, was, look, you cannot keep someone locked up for 6 months without making the most basic assessment through a bond hearing of whether or not that individual, number one, is a flight risk, or number two, is a threat to public safety. And so as a result of that, this massive federal immigration detention system had this very crucial check where individuals who had been detained for 6 months got an individualized hearing to determine if they were a risk to, fleeing the country while their case continued, or if they were a risk to the public interest, essentially. And that's huge, because that's not a distinction without a difference. It's a distinction that matters. These folks who are being detained in these jail-like sittings, 2/3 of them, for example, who are seeking asylum, eventually win their asylum case. But we know that their odds go up tremendously if they're able to bring that case from outside of detention. And so this was a real blow. But I do want to highlight that the Supreme Court didn't say, hey, you can lock these people up indefinitely with no checks whatsoever. What they said was, we disagree with the statutory holding, and we're sending this back down to the lower courts to consider whether the Constitution permits detention for 6 months without an individualized determination. Now, I ultimately think that courts will say the Constitution requires these individual determinations, but in the interim, this could have real consequences for individuals in detention.
I did a radio interview earlier today. We ended up talking about just access to legal services for folks who have been detained. And, time and time again, it's a life-changing access or moment for if somebody has access to legal services so that they can get representation and be able to negotiate or navigate these processes.
It's the difference between everything and nothing, essentially. And I've spent a good amount of time in detention centers across the country. And look, these centers are not in downtown Los Angeles, right? They're not where your loved ones can come and visit you. They are in far-flung locations. It's extremely difficult for lawyers to get out there at all. And it changes the whole ballpark for an individual, even when they literally feel persecution if returned to their home country. When kept in these facilities and nowhere near their family for months on end, ultimately folks give up meritorious claims. And that cannot be the definition of justice.
And it feels that one of the places where the question of justice is more and more important these days is in terms of asylum claims. And just over the last couple of days, we've seen the Attorney General, the way I see it, is to take authority from the immigration courts in terms of adjudicating many of these asylum claims. Is that the right read? Are there things that we're missing here? It feels that, Attorney General Sessions is piece by piece, not just dismantling the immigration system, but really any sense of justice and fairness within the system. And I feel like this asylum question is just the latest permutation.
Attorney General Sessions has been very clear about his skepticism to asylum seekers. And, in his mind, and he even said in the changes to asylum policy that they announced in, I think, beginning in late January, right? He sees this as a system that he thinks is fraudulent. I have a very different perspective. I've represented asylum seekers, and in particular, the National Immigration Law Center has a nationwide class action on behalf of Salvadoran asylum seekers. And I've had the privilege, but also just the sobering experience of sitting with my clients who are fleeing persecution in El Salvador over the last decade. And I don't see a system that's full of fraud. What I see is an incredible deep insecurity in Central America that's causing individuals to flee when they otherwise would not, when they have no choice. So the specific change in asylum policy that I'm really concerned about is the Attorney General has basically flip-flopped on the policy of processing asylum applications in a order from how long they've been pending. There are two problems I see with this. So they've moved to a first in, first out system. So if you filed today, you're more likely to have your asylum claim processed than if you filed 4 years ago. The first problem with this is credibility of the witnesses in an asylum case are essential. And we just know this all based on our own memory. Your memory and your ability to present in an adversarial court system where you may not be represented facts about the traumatic situation that led you to flee your home country, that is going to be harder for you 5 years out from that trauma than 1 year out from that trauma. And the second is, look, this is a backdoor way for the Sessions administration to stop asylum seekers from obtaining the right to work. The law is that after asylum claim has been pending for a year, you have the right to seek work authorization. I think this is a very clear-cut attempt by the Attorney General to deny a higher number of asylum claims and never give these asylum seekers the chance to work pending their day in court.
Absolutely. And I mean, just the stories that you read about women and children just escaping just awfulness in Central America and turning themselves into Border Patrol and asking for asylum. What the Justice Department is doing is nothing short of awful. So let's talk about something potentially a little bit happier, right? A little bit more cheerful.
Let's do.
This is turning into a very depressing episode. So deferred action for childhood arrivals. This is, the program that was established by President Obama in 2012. September of last year, President Trump decided to end the program, and you all, plus a number of others, took to the courts. Where are we at this point with the injunction? How do you see this playing out? Again, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of confusion, but this just feels like it has the potential for us to get a pretty big win.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that right now, I think DACA recipients, at least in the court setting, are winning. The state of play is that there are right now 2 nationwide injunctions in place, one out of litigation in San Francisco by the state of California and several other actors, and the other out of the litigation that we're part of in New York, along with our colleagues Make the Road New York, the Yale Law School Clinic, and notably 16 states in the District of Columbia. Here's what those injunctions provide, though. They require the federal government to accept DACA renewals on the same basis as they had prior to the Trump administration's termination of DACA on September 5th. Let me tell you who's not covered, however. If you've never had DACA or before September the 5th, these injunctions don't cover you. So that's what's missing right now. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, despite the positive in the courts right now for individuals who had DACA on September 5th, we obviously still need a permanent solution by Congress. And most notably, that's because if your application was in the mail for DACA and you had done everything right on September the 5th, you're out of luck. The one thing I want to say to just kind of frame this conversation is we do now know, and we're getting increasing documented reports of folks, whether they're part of our lawsuit or others nationwide, who have, since the first injunction went into place on January 9th, filed their DACA renewal and now have actually had that granted and have 2 more years of DACA and work authorization as a result of these court injunctions.
Right. So, but then the question that's not in front of the court is whether or not the administration can end the program. I mean, the question in front of the court is through which process can the administration end the program, which from my perspective just underscores the need for a legislative solution. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. I mean, these injunctions at base say, we're not telling you can't end the program, President Trump. What we're saying is you didn't do it right, and so we're not going to allow you to do it unless and until you do it the right way. Now, I think in honesty, this turns the screws on the Trump administration. This is an administration that has tried to have it both ways, talking about love in their heart for DACA recipients, yet shutting down the program and not negotiating in good faith with Congress. So I think that it really calls the question of President Trump, are you really going to be the person who shuts down a program that has done so much good for this country and that 86% of Americans support?
So as you know, the podcast is called Only in America. And I ask all of our guests the same final question. And that question is, finish this sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America, when I found out I could have the privilege to argue in court against the termination of DACA, did I text my immigrant mom who had said, let me know if there's anything I can do to help the dreamers. And I told her, the resistance needs childcare, Mom. And she got on a plane and came out and took care of my family so I could work hard and try to do my best for my clients. And so I say only in America do we have our immigrant moms who have looked out for our own dreams and help us look out for the dreams of others.
Karen Tumlin, Legal Director for the National Immigration Law Center. I just really want to thank you for everything that you do, all the good people at NILC. I know that millions and millions of people depend on what you guys do every single day. So thank you.
Thank you so much for spending this time with me and for always being NILC's great partner, Ali.
There's more about Karen and the National Immigration Law Center at immigrationforum.org. And while you're there, subscribe to Only in America. And this week, a warm welcome to our new listeners in Colombia, Finland, Germany, Honduras, Iceland, Mexico, the Philippines, and Uganda. And wherever you're listening, if you're using iTunes, help us build our audience by writing a review. And for all of us, let's take a second to share this episode with our friends. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
This Friday, March 23rd, brings yet another congressional deadline as leadership is negotiating an omnibus spending bill. While the Democrats will not shut down the government over DACA, rumors of a deal have persisted. On Fox News Sunday, Mike Wallace asked Senate Minority Whip Dick Durbin if his party was holding the Dreamers hostage.
President Trump was the one who abolished the DACA program on September the 5th. President Trump has rejected 6 different bipartisan proposals to pass a law and solve the problem he created. He is the key to solving the DACA problem. I have spoken to the leaders on both sides of the aisle, House and Senate, begging them to do something and do it now for DACA, even included in the omnibus bill. But the president's approval to move forward is critical for the Republicans to be willing to
it's
act.
a yes or no. Are you going to insist on a DACA fix as part of this bill, or are you going to let the bill pass, avoid a shutdown, and do nothing about DACA?
We're not going to have a shutdown, but I'm urging the leaders to basically come together and understand there is an emergency at hand here. 780,000 young people have their lives hanging in the balance because President Trump killed the DACA program. We have to move on a bipartisan basis to put it back in business.
Whether or not a compromise makes it into the omnibus, there are questions that came up this week that are going to come up in the weeks ahead. For example, how much border funding and for how long? Is it $1.7 billion as the administration originally requested? Or is it $25 billion over 3 years to build a beautiful wall? Or how generous are the DACA protections? $800,000 to protect those who are currently in the program? Or protect closer to $1.8 million to get closer to the original DREAM Act? And what about ICE agents and detention beds? More of those gets us closer to the administration's goal of massive deportation numbers. The questions go on and on. So, if there is a resolution this week, great. High fives all around. But no one should think our work is going to be done. On a better note, Gaby Pacheco, who with 3 friends walked from Miami to Washington, D.C. in 2010 to urge Congress to pass the DREAM Act, wrote just a beautiful op-ed for this week's New York Times. In her piece, she observed how quickly politicians try to co-opt youth movements for their own agendas. She wrote, "Both Republicans and Democrats claimed to care about immigrants, but both parties continued to deport people and failed to pass immigration reform." A few weeks back on Only in America, here's what Gaby told me about her experience as a dreamer.
It was an anomaly to have a young, undocumented person sharing their story. I remember in 2005, 2006, I was flown up to Washington, D.C. to speak at the National Press Club, and I told my story in front of like 40 reporters. And they were all in awe because I was willing to give my name, have my picture taken, and they were just like, do you know the trouble you're putting yourself in? And I didn't, but I also felt that I was like, come on, I'm one of millions. Like, Are they really going to do something? But 2006, immigration did come after me. They knocked at my door looking for me, and unfortunately also found my family and put my parents and sisters in deportation proceeding. And that really shifted things in my mind, and it made me realize the bigger issue that we have. It just made me also a better advocate, because I realized the massive stakes that there are for immigrant families in this country, but also how broken our immigration system is.
Finally, a spring training home run this week on Saturday Night Live. Michael Che on the Weekend Update offered a backhanded compliment to the immigrant Major League Baseball stars about to embark on a new season.
President Trump welcomed the World Series champions Houston Astros to the White House, which is weird because baseball is the one industry where immigrants actually are taking our jobs. The Houston Astros were even nice enough to give Trump a jersey with his approval rating on the back.
Now, I'd sing you Take Me Out to the Ball Game, but, this is a podcast, not an album. And that's our show. It's produced by Emily Chow and Regina Medina. The executive producer is Kathleen Farrell. Only in America comes to you each week from the National Immigration Forum in Washington, D.C. I'm Ali Nirani. See you next week.